Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So today we're meeting with Penny Parker. Penny's journey to working in the justice system and in prisons in particular was circuitous via 2 years of a geography degree to swapping to law and qualifying as a solicitor and working in corporate law in a city law firm. An opportunity to visit her local prison opened up a new world and led to Penny giving up practicing law and training as a tutor for a restorative justice programme, which she ran for 12 years in HMP Wandsworth and then HMP Bronzefield and also Pentonville. Over the 12 years, she experienced delivering it in Cat C settings as well as at HMP Gartree with people on life sentences. So, cementing her volunteering experience in prison with a master's degree in criminology and criminal justice, Penny worked for Prison Fellowship as an interim CEO and then decided that she had talked enough about how she thought preparing people for release could be improved and that she should try and show how it could be done. The result is Stand Out, the London-based rehabilitation charity that she founded in 2018. Welcome, Penny.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Hi Penny, good to meet you. It sounds like you've had quite a rich and varied career, and I wondered if you could tell us about your journey from wanting to be a geographer to being a key advocate for restorative justice.
Yeah, it does. It feels like I've had lots of changes along the way. I think when you're in the middle of changes, sometimes you feel perhaps that you're still searching for something and, trying to work out how to find that thing. But I think there is a sort of thread through the elements now when I look back that I can see the bits that I particularly enjoyed. And so the elements of geography that I loved most were always the human geography side. And obviously there's sort of strong links there to ultimately criminology and the interest in people and space and place. And indeed, I think that had there been, I don't think there was actually particularly at the time, but the study of carceral geography, maybe I'd have kind of gone straight into kind of engaging with that and being really interested in it. And I think the law was something, I think I came from a generation where when you left university, there was a very strong driver to sort of professional qualifications and either accountancy training or law training. And I sort of slightly followed the herd. I don't know that I would look back and reflect on a great kind of decision making and leadership on my own part for what I would do. It seemed like a good qualification to get. But I did actually love that environment, and it was fast paced and it was very varied. But I think what I realized over time, and I practiced law in the city for about 8 years, was that what I really enjoyed were the people that I got to meet, the interesting kind of projects that we might be working on. And it was more the people and the nature of the projects, so, the particular business we might be working with, that I realized interested me more than the nuts and bolts and the kind of black and white detail of the law. And so although I left, in fact, I kind of gave up on a first round of maternity leave, and I did that fully imagining that I would go back. In the end, I didn't. And through a sort of little segue into some legal publishing for a bit, I then found myself sort of being caught by conversations from, for me, it was a group from church who were going into prison, and just being kind of fascinated by the reflections of this life that was not very far from where I lived, but, that secret world. And so, if you live close to a local prison, it is this enormous, quite often physical presence in your community, but a world that you have no idea kind of other than what is fed to you through media images. And I suppose, I'm old enough to kind of remember Porridge and kind of really classic images of prison. And indeed actually some of the challenges of the 80s, the Strange Boys riots, all of that, that kind of imagery. But I think what I sensed from friends who went in was it was the connection with people that was so interesting. And so, kind of gradually that was what drew me into thinking I wanted to go and join them and to see how I found it. And I sort of instantly found it fascinating. And I think for anyone who has worked in prison and worked with people, I suspect would share this reflection that when you're in that environment, you have this extraordinary privilege to engage with people in a really direct way. You cut straight to the heart of the matter, as it were, quite often in conversations with people. And I think I quite quickly thought about how when in our normal lives, we kind of have the niceties of how we might react to people or what we might say. And yet here was this really fascinating situation where you could ask and get into some really meaningful engagement and relationships and contact with people. And that was sort of what hooked me in. So that kind of, that cemented the first step, as it were, into the prison. And I think I did a stint volunteering once a week with the chaplaincy team, just being a sort of additional pastoral support. So we would have door keys, we would be on the wings, and naturally then you were asked, quite often the classic question was, Miss, where are you from? Are you probation, education, kind of whatever. But somehow actually when you didn't have one of those very formalized agendas, you had the opportunity to have some really real conversations with people. So I loved that. And that was working with a really experienced managing chaplain, chap called Gordon Ashworth, who was, I think, the first Methodist managing chaplain in the prison estate. And he had pretty much spent his whole ordained career in prisons, which again was relatively unusual, certainly at the time, in that people would quite often go into it later in life. And he, through the prisons that he had been in over the course of his career, had been involved in setting up and running the Sycamore Tree Restorative Justice Programme. And so he knew from his own experiences how powerful it was. Wandsworth was his final post before retirement, and he wanted his legacy to be that we got Sycamore Tree up and running in Wandsworth. And so that was, kind of what led me to that. And I think in my looking at restorative justice, there was something, because it's quite often described as an alternative to our criminal justice system. And quite often people juxtapose an understanding of how our justice system works, or how what we would call a retributive system works, with a restorative approach. And so I think there was something in me that kind of also slightly rang a bell with actually having done, criminal law, because that's a compulsory part of your training as a solicitor, and kind of knowing how that process played out, and then seeing how differently a restorative process could play out. And I was hooked on that.
Thank you. And I think for anyone who's either worked or lived in a prison, they will all be familiar with the Sycamore Tree project, but could you say a little bit more about what the aims and objectives of it were for those people that participated?
Yeah, so the project was described as a victim awareness course and an introduction to restorative justice. Really interesting program. It started in the United States and it came over to England in I think the late 90s, and it was a course that was really designed to support people, to work with people in prison, to help them understand the impact of their offending. And the thinking behind setting up the program and running it in prison in that way was very much that it would contribute and help support people in thinking about their own attitudes to the impact of their crime, and the impact of the crime on themselves and their families, and that it would contribute to that behaviour change piece that would ultimately lead to reduced reoffending, or actually what I much prefer to phrase it as a kind of positive life lived on the outside. So it was introduced, I think the first prison was the Mount, if I recall correctly, and very quickly caught on, and within 10 years was running over really quite a significant proportion of the prison estate. It was run by prison fellowship by volunteers who were trained, and it's a program that was had a structure to it, had a manual. It's 6 sessions. Tutors were trained in how to run it. But I think what it did was, and why I think chaplaincies in particular, because it was usually run through chaplaincy teams, loved it, was it created this extraordinary space for people in prison to come and have really human conversations, to come and to think through things about themselves, their own journeys, that were in a space that felt as though it was outside of the sort of prison offender management process, or kind of the planning that one might have to put in place if you were thinking about performing or completing things that you were required to complete. Ironically, although that I think was very much its agenda, it did end up being put on many people's sentence plans, and I think that was a recognition that that prisons could see that it had an impact on people, and actually because there wasn't a lot else like it at the time. There were the prison-run programs like Thinking Skills that were run usually by psychologists in the prison, but actually Sycamore Tree, I think, offered a different way of coming at working with people that complemented other things that were offered.
Yeah, certainly when I was working in the FENS unit, quite a few of the men chose to do the Sycamore Tree project and got a lot out of it. They spoke very highly about what they were doing, and I think there was some kind of safety in doing something that wasn't a formal part of what the prison system expected of them. So it's almost like they're able to engage at a different level because it, I think, perhaps inspired their own connection with themselves rather than feeling that they were doing it to please other people. So I think that was a really valuable aspect. Why did the Sycamore Tree project end up folding? It's no longer running, is it?
Yeah, so I believe, I mean, I haven't been part of that process, but it's, I think, gone through a new accreditation process, and for reasons that probably I'm, not the best person to speak about, has folded. But I understand that there is a strong desire to look at how they can find something that would, kind of meet that need. And I think that, as you said, what it did was offer something outside of the formalised and expected frameworks. And I think that it's widely recognised that when people are working in the framework of, in particular, kind of the set range of programmes that are on offer, that knowing what the desirable answer is, being able to sort of navigate your way through it is commonly recognised as a challenge of working in that space. And I think that when you have something like Sycamore Tree coming in, you genuinely create a space where there isn't an agenda. And so even though it's on a sentence plan, there's a freedom to be honest. And I think that there is something about the role of a group coming in from outside prison. I think volunteers definitely have that impact, and we use volunteers on Standout and think that there's definitely a part of that too. But there's also something about being a group that are not part of the system, that you can build trust with people, and create that safety that allows people to feel as though this is for them and that you're not about to use it or take from it, or indeed use it against them. And I think that was part of its past. I very much hope that something will emerge from this, because I think it's a very necessary part of an offering across the prison estate.
Thank you. And what was your experience of it, and what did you learn about yourself from your engagement in that project?
That's a good question. I think that anything like that if offers you the opportunity to listen to other people and to hear other people's stories, I think for me it opened up this idea that people's stories were so important and that having space to tell them was so important. It's when I talk to new members of the staff team at Standout, that's one of the sort of ideas that I come from, is actually we're privileged. We get to hear stories. We get to kind of listen and be in the place where we can explore people's background. And, I think whenever you do that, you learn a bit about yourself. You get to reflect a bit more on the experiences that you've had and how they impact you. And it kind of just, giving you space, I think, to be a bit more self-aware, and to have a better understanding about maybe also what's important to you.
Thank you, Penny. So we've kind of touched on this a bit in the introduction, but so we understand that you considered that even when people in prison were motivated to change, there was very little to help them transition out into prison. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the context for a lot of that thinking was working in Wandsworth, and just, I think, naively to begin with, assuming that there would be naturally a progression for people that was really practical, that was focused on life outside, that would recognise the damaging impact of being in prison in the first place. I mean, that there would naturally also be the support for some of the reasons that take people to prison. And I think that over a period of years of delivering Sycamore Tree, I was aware that frequently people would come to the end of it and would then say to me, Miss, what can I do next? Like, what else is there like this that I could do? And so realizing that we had delivered something that was of value to them, that they valued and appreciated and understood what it meant for them. But that actually there wasn't obviously anything else that was like it. And I think I watched through the introduction of the Transforming Rehabilitation agenda. I remember reading I guess it was probably the green paper that invited feedback and comments. And, it was framed in a way that seemed actually potentially quite promising in terms of the recognition of what was needed. And then actually, I think we all know the outworkings of that, just failed to deliver, at all. So I think it was that combination of that listening experience of hearing people ask. Initially, I naively would say, well, why don't you talk to your prison offender manager? Ask them what else you can do. Well, they'll have some things you can do. And of course, the reality was there just wasn't something else. And I think it just whirred away in my brain for a while at thinking about what the experience of prison did to people. I think there were various experiences that I would say I reflect on and remember. Quite often working with men, which was the bulk of my experience, actually recognizing how defensive, in fact, they were. So the bravado that was put up. Sometimes the bravado about families, I would quite often, because they talk about the impact on their families. And so then you're into a space where you can say, how's your family doing? How's it with them at the moment? And so frequently hearing a slightly, just a simple, oh yeah, she's doing fine. No, they're fine. And thinking, really? Like, that kind of can't be true. And that realization, and then thinking, oh, that's really interesting, because is that what she's telling you, or is that what you're telling yourself? And is that a coping mechanism? And I sort of started to piece together things and realized that I thought that leaving prison wasn't this thing that I probably previously imagined to be an easy journey, kind of like the gates open and out you stroll and, kind of everything picks up again. And realizing that actually leaving prison is really challenging and actually, I think, frequently terrifying for people. I think the anxiety that it induces when you don't know what's going to happen, when everything that's been kind of locked down and out of your kind of control comes back up to, in your face, hit you. To how do you rebuild those relationships when they've been so fractured or so managed by, the visits or the calls or whatever? And I just sort of became convinced that actually, if we could help people think about that process beforehand and think about what they wanted it to look like and what their what they wanted to achieve and what they wanted to aim for, and how, if actually they were determined that they didn't want to come back to prison again, what would that look like? What would a sort of thriving life look like? And that, so that was one of the things that kind of gnawed away at me, and that I guess sort of led to me to think about what could be done in this space. And for transforming rehabilitation, one of the things was some really tick box simplistic programs. 5 mornings to prepare you for leaving prison, absolutely nothing gained, either in really very much knowledge, but certainly nothing in terms of that inner piece around confidence, self-esteem, believing that could be anything out there for you, or indeed the tools to really help you navigate what are likely to be the challenges along the way.
Are you connected to Simon Scott, Penny?
The name's...
Well, we just published a conversation with him this week, actually, and he's served a life sentence and he's studying for a PhD, looking at what people need when they get out of prison. And I suppose what was really striking about his conversation was how he spoke about what the prison system feels that you need leaving prison, and what a mismatch there is with what you actually need when you leave prison. It's just this conversation is just making me think of that one.
Yeah, well, I think one of my current bugbears, if I can put it like that, is and there are some positives that have come out of this, but ultimately it's not what we need, is the conversation around employment for people leaving prison, and this persistent line that actually giving someone a job will reduce reoffending, make our community safer, and hey presto, job done. And I mean, I'd love it to be that simple, but it's not, because actually there's a whole conversation piece around employers, and that is, I think, the one upside of that conversation is that employers are now starting to engage. But we need a really honest conversation that actually, if we haven't supported people to deal with the issues that took them to prison in the first place, and if we haven't recognised that we've layered on top of all of that the trauma of being in prison, we cannot expect people to simply walk out that gate and cope. We had an example yesterday where the team did a gate meet with someone, and they said the whole experience of being with this chap through from 10 o'clock in the morning till sort of mid to late afternoon. So they took him to probation, took him for something to eat and drink. They gave him a phone. They took him to probation. They took him to his CAS hospital. But they said there were various moments where at any point, without them being there to help just support and kind of unpick the knotty problems that arose, it could have gone off the rails immediately. And that's a short time frame that on that first day, but actually it's first week, it's first month, it's first 3 months, and so actually I really agree. I think that an honest conversation about what people in prison need, and really difficultly I would say deserve, and I know people would find that really challenging, but if we're serious about making changes, that's how we have to come at it.
Thank you. Well, that's really interesting, and it's fascinating to be listening to your perspective on this, when, as Naomi said, we had this conversation with Simon Scott very recently, talking very much from an insider's perspective. And actually it does need the totality to give you the full picture of what a struggle it is. So anyway, Penny, moving on, tell us what the SPEAR programme is, and how did it lead you and your colleague Joe Fellows to found Stand Out?
So SPEAR was really my sort of light bulb moment, having all of these sort of thoughts whirring around how we could put together a programme that would be kind of delivered in a kind of relational, human way, and would be meaningful, relevant, and impactful for people leaving prison. And I think I really didn't actually think I could write a program. I mean, I felt that it was a very specific skill set. It wasn't one that I necessarily had. I could imagine what it would be like, but putting it actually together was a different matter. And I was introduced to the SPEAR course. It's run by a project called the Restorative Trust. It works in quite a different setting. So it's a program designed for young people who are in what the government will categorise as the NEET category. So not in education, employment and training, which is a categorisation for 16 to 24-year-olds who essentially have dropped out of education and not moved into either further education or into employment. And all the evidence is that if you don't engage in that age gap very quickly, they move into the very long-term unemployed, and all sorts of other obvious kind of issues that go with that. And I was invited to go and visit this course being run, and just loved two things really: how it works. So using a coaching style of delivery, which very much empowered the participants in the room, a group setting, and working through issues with a group of young people. But also the content was really interesting. So it had an employment focus. So it had some really practical things around employment, putting CVs together, having a mock interview, meeting employers. But the largest part of it was actually all about building self-confidence and self-esteem, and giving people sort of life skills. So actually just the contact and involvement with the program, developing people's communication skills, leadership skills, teamwork skills, and opening their eyes a little bit to the idea of how much their mindset influences how they behave and the choices that they make. So in particular, looking at a victim and a power mindset. So that idea of when you're in a power mindset, choosing to take control even of small choices rather than blaming others or seeing yourself as powerless. And also fixed and a growth mindset, which is a kind of now quite well recognised educational concept, and best exhibited by the idea that actually, as we're young children, we naturally have a growth mindset, as it were hardwired to be in a growth mindset, to develop, to try new things, to get up again when we fall down, when we first walk, to try things again. And that as we mature, we become less inclined and more fearful of failure. And those things actually are quite often reinforced by our families or by society. But it's a really interesting idea to unpack with people and to get them to explore and to think about how they operate, how do they see themselves, or how can they look back and think about decisions or periods of time and what has been the sort of leading mindset. So I went to see Spear. I kind of loved the whole package, the kind of how it was delivered and the kind of content. And I basically spent about 5 years trying to persuade their leadership to come into prison. We would have conversations on a regular basis, kind of at least once a year. And sometimes other people might come across them and they would say to me, "Oh, I've heard about this thing, the Spear course. I think it would work in prison." So I'd go, "Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. Let's try and persuade them again." And to cut a long story short, I think, I don't know, maybe they were exasperated by me because I kept knocking on their door. I kind of said, "Train me up, I could help you adapt it." They were very mission focused, actually. It's really interesting I now see when I'm running a small charity, how important it is actually to keep the main thing. And that was their main thing. Their main thing was working outside of the justice system with young people in that context. And so, that's a good learning point if you're running a charity. Don't be drawn into kind of other things that you could do. But the long and the short is that they then introduced me to Jo, and she had worked with them, and she had been really interested at, they have a phenomenal success rate, but she had been really interested at what the harder to reach, the more difficult challenges were with people. And she could see that there was a pattern in there, that they were usually people with more complex backgrounds. And it would be perhaps young men who'd had justice experience, and the sort of additional barriers that then that introduced into their journey. So she had that experience of running Spear, knowing what that looked like and knowing how it worked, and a real interest in how to reach those that for whom that wasn't the right setting. And I was just passionate about wanting to do something kind of creative and innovative in the prison space. And we finally got to the point where Spear and the Restorative Trust shared their curriculum with us, and kind of effectively said, "Go away and see what you can do." And so we had the core of their curriculum. We literally had the kind of PDF of their curriculum, and we were able to kind of pick out the elements that we thought would work, and that with my experience of running Sycamore Tree, I was confident we could work in the prison space. And then we kind of also brought into it things that were directly relevant to prison, that came from some of the thinking I'd done about what does it mean to leave prison, and actually what might we want to kind of look at with people. And so we developed a curriculum that took us about 6 to 8 months. We were in conversation with HMP Wandsworth, and in the spring of early 2017, we went into pilot the first programme in Wandsworth, and that was the two of us having written it and put it together, printing off resources on our home printers and going into Wandsworth with the blessing of the Governor and Deputy Governor, head of reducing reoffending at the time, and running a pilot. And it was really interesting because very quickly through the first programme, we were getting incredibly positive feedback from the first group of guys, essentially saying, we've never done anything like this. This is really interesting. And, they'd been to short kind of employment focused prepare a CV workshops. There was, I think, someone delivering some kind of online CV production process, but nothing that meant anything. It was a piece of paper. And for us, actually, it's not about producing a CV. It's about finding the individual behind and what their passions are and what they want to aim for and actually what their strengths are and their qualities. And we ran 4 pilot courses through 2017 as a learning process. And we decided that we wouldn't become a charity until we were absolutely sure that we could make this thing work. And so at the end of 2017, we then started to set up, to go through the process of establishing a charity. And that happened in the spring of 2018.
Thank you. How did you negotiate that with the Governor of Wandsworth then?
So there was a happy coincidence that the head of reducing reoffending at the time had actually separately come across the SPEAR course and was really interested in how it worked and could see its impact and its power. So actually, it was, there was definitely a kind of happy coincidence of actually being able to have a conversation with someone who went, oh yeah, okay, I know that, and we were very thorough in our preparation, and I think we do think that everyone thought there was a bigger organisation behind us at the time, which you kind of, well, you have to start somewhere. So it was, someone at one point said, could they meet our CEO, thinking that there must be someone behind the two of us. So that did make us smile. But yeah, we were very kind of professional and responsive to the prison. And, we wrote really detailed reports. We got the impression that the first time we wrote a written report that we were probably the first time a third sector organisation had ever kind of offered a written report summing up what had gone well, what had gone wrong, what our learning was, what we thought could be done better next time. And so it just very quickly became a really positive partnership. And I guess, there was nothing. So we were making a difference. One of the things that we discovered, and I'm really, proud that we pushed through with it. And I think it's one of the things we'll never be able to kind of totally show, but we genuinely feel we changed the sector on, is that we discovered that none of the support agencies of any kind, statutory or otherwise, were supporting people to understand the importance of how to manage a disclosure process if they were applying for a job, or indeed, kind of how that would manifest in terms of an application form with a tick box, or how you might then look for an employer who was open to employing people with convictions. But how important it is to know if and when your conviction will be spent. And, either that's really motivating that your custodial sentence is less than, at the time it was 4 years. And so therefore, in the requisite period of 4 years, I think it was +7 at the time, you wouldn't have on an ordinary DBS to disclose your offence, and you could actually tick no to have you got any unspent convictions. That's quite a motivating piece of information to think there could be a point in time that you could leave this behind. But equally, if that's not the case, and actually it's not going to be spent because it's a longer sentence, to know how to manage that process. To equip people with actually the tools to know how to go about talking about it, or that you could even talk about it. So, that was one of the sort of practical, definitely sort of employment related things we did. But I think also, what we know has really landed with people is, in fact, the mindset work and the life skills piece. And some newer pieces that we've added more recently. So we did a curriculum refresh last year, 2023 actually was when we launched it. And that was very much based on feedback from participants. And we've introduced a piece around working with probation. And again, a very practical piece. But if no one actually has the time to really take you through your licence conditions or explain what licence conditions are really about, if you get that, that's fine. But if not, and someone's handing you a piece of paper and you don't really understand the importance of them or how they will be worked out or how to manage that relationship with your probation officer, or even what the role of the probation officer is, is the probation officer out there to police you with the sole purpose of trying to get you back inside again? Or actually, if you knew that they wanted to work with you to find the positives, and that was one of the reflections yesterday, was he went back, this chap, to see the probation officer who had recalled him previously, and yet the coaches were able to sit in on the conversation and totally change the nature of that exchange so that she could realize that he was actually determined to do things differently. He realized that probation officer didn't just want to get him back inside, and he had a support network, and they could work out what the next steps would positively be. So that's a kind of reflection of some of the just practical stuff that I think is so important for people to know and to be supported with. And it's landed incredibly well with people who find it really, really helpful and reflect back that they've been perhaps around the houses before and not really understood how to manage that process, how to come into a conversation with your probation officer with an open and positive adult voice. How to come in with a growth mindset or a power mentality. You might not like some of the things that are put in front of you, but what are the ones that you can choose to control and the positive decisions that you can make? There's hope. We hope they equip people in the short term in leaving in those situations, but actually they're about life skills and long-term life skills. And so we know actually they will impact, we hope, relationships more broadly.
Thank you for that. I wonder if you could briefly describe for me what it actually looks like. What does Stand Out do? So you've got the programme in Wandsworth Prison. What's it look like?
Yeah. So we think Stand Out is sort of, it's always difficult, isn't it, to say it's unique because someone will go, oh, it's actually quite like something else that we haven't yet found. But I think that it's the both and of the work inside prison and the support that we offer outside prison. So, and that for me, that was one of those no-brainer pieces that as I looked at what was offered and how things worked, and I could see that there could be really good projects on the outside. But if you simply give someone a telephone number or a leaflet and say, ring, this number or turn up at this place when you come out, and there'll be great support there, potentially really great support. If there's no relationship there, chances are they're not going to follow through, or only the most motivated will follow through. And so we wanted to do something that bridged that gap. So we decided that the way to do that was to do, our way of doing it is to run a course inside. That's a group course. So typically we'll work with around 12 men. And the course currently runs 4 days a week over 3 weeks. We have a recruitment week beforehand. We do all our recruitment ourselves. So the coaches are out on the wings, having conversations with people. We love that what that enables is that we get to draw into the program people who potentially wouldn't get picked out by an activities team or an officer on a wing, because, sometimes there are people who they will choose not to put forward for whatever reasons, whether it's behavioural or actually just their invisibility. And so the way, from the first encounter with Stand Out, we think we're doing something differently from typically how people are used to working in the prison space. So we recruitment week, 3 weeks on the program, and it's really intensive. It's most days, morning and afternoon, which is quite unusual at the moment because that's working across regimes, especially post-COVID with lockdowns and so on. But we, the basis we put it to the prisoners is this is how we work. This creates momentum. It creates that focus, and it builds relationship. One of the great things that happens in that group is that actually they become friends and often reflect that they've formed community for the first time in prison. There's a sense of trust of us and trust between the group as well, and that's a really rich, special thing to watch in that environment, especially a London prison with such transience and such kind of challenging situations. And the programme covers, as I said, those practical things, so practical preparation. We involve volunteers, so volunteers come in to help us write CVs and to do mock interviews, and we bring an employer in to do a presentation. And those are, really practical, really valued. There's a transactional thing, there's a thing that happens, people end up with a CV, they have a mock interview. But of course, what also happens is that there's connection and humanity. And there are people coming in who've given up their time, and that impacts people. You give up an afternoon from work to come in here. That's really interesting. Why would you do that? And it changes attitudes and perceptions of the volunteers who come in as well. So we know that it's kind of coming at it both ways, that actually we're impacting the wider conversation around prisons. And I think that's really important at the moment when, our justice system is so frequently in the news for such difficult reasons. And so if we can do our bit to help more ordinary members of our society understand that our prisons should not be hidden away, that they need to know what happens in our prisons, and that we can change attitudes, then that's a really key part of it. So the programme is 3 weeks. It culminates in a graduation celebration afternoon, which is a great opportunity for the participants to be stretched, to lead on presentations, but for us to give certificates. And we do that in a way that is quite kind of unique to us. So we do it with a really personalised affirmation of what we've seen in people. So calling out their strengths and their qualities that the coaches have observed, and giving them a challenge, recognising that actually what we're saying is you may not be coming out, immediately, but these are things that you can put in place and use for the remaining time that you've got in prison. And then our offer is that we will offer support to people outside of prison once they're released, if they've completed the programme inside. So the 3 weeks finish, we then see them week to week. So the coaches are regularly in the prison, will do follow-up one-to-ones, potentially run more workshops, get the guys back together again, maybe host another employer visit, or have a talk or a group discussion about a subject that the participants have suggested. And then the outside of prison part is then totally individualised. So obviously differing release dates, picking up with people wherever they're at. And our offer is genuinely an open one, that we will work with you to support you in whatever way you need as you come out of prison. So we've done that piece on employment, but we are not about putting you straight into a job and ticking the box and saying job done, because actually we kind of know that is not what necessarily most people do not need that. Most people need time to adjust. They need accommodation to be resolved. They need to rebuild relationships. They need to get themselves back into a headspace of confidence, of navigating society, having been kept away from it, to actually just feel confident that they who they are in that new space. Our offer in the community is open-ended. So I decided to do all the things that people told me I couldn't do, which was, everyone says you can't have an open-ended offer, because how will you ever measure your outcomes, and how will you ever fund it, and how will you ever cost it? And we've just been determined from the very beginning that everything we will do is about listening to people, and we'll do the learning piece rather than sort of dream up above, if you like, and impose down. And so we've kept it that way. And so far it's worked, and we continue to monitor how many people we have on a sort of active involvement, but unsurprisingly it tails off as people stabilise. But people love the idea that they can give us a call, I've been in this job for 18 months, it's going really, really well, but I'm going to apply for a new one, and can I get in touch, can you guys help me update things? So that's just a lovely offer to be able to make, we feel.
Well, that's fascinating. So you mentioned funding, and I was wondering how you get your money. Does the prison give you anything?
So we have chosen from the outset to charitably fund all of our work. There could be the subject of a whole new podcast. But the short answer is that contractual funding arrangements through HMPPS are not, I think, the way to develop and sustain a project with with a very clear purpose. And, during our lifetime, the dynamic purchasing system in prisons was launched. It was initially only 1 year funding, and it is now mostly 2, but not necessarily always. And projects can be I think they work very well for projects that want to do a bit here and a bit there, and perhaps a very defined offering. For us, we feel that they haven't ever worked. There's never been anything that would fit us, and the fact that it's just not sustainable. I mean, between the last financial year and the current financial year, I think it's an 80% reduction in DPS funding from HMPPS. So for prisons for projects who relied on that, you can't navigate that as a small charity. And we've chosen to recruit a really excellent team. We invest in them, we train them, we spend a lot on their training initially to train them up in coaching skills, and some of the other pieces that we do around that: mental health first aid training, kind of confidence in handling disclosure training with Unlock. And so actually I don't want project funding that means I have a team of 5 for 1 year and the next year I'm laying them off and waiting to see where the next bit of money comes up. So we have charitably funded. We have some amazing grant making bodies who've supported us, some quite well known in the sector, so who understand the justice sector and who've been very faithful to us. And we're working on building other funding streams. We have some individual supporters. We do the Big Give every year, which is a really significant contribution to our funding. But growth has therefore been intentionally slow. So, Wandsworth in 2017-18, Pentonville we added in 2019, and then we went to Wentworth Scrubs in 2022, and we're now starting to think about where we would go next. But we want intentionally to build a long-term relationship with the prison, to be a sort of trusted partner, and to be able to really contribute to the prison as a whole, as well as to the people that we're working with. If we can deliver really excellent work and set the standard for what a quality project working in prisons looks like, then actually other people will follow that. And I think we've seen other people adapt and do things that are more like what we do, and that's there's such need. That's really, really important. But I think we also contribute to the prison by being committed to them, and faithful in our partnership, and not just dotting around. I'd kind of love there to be an HMPPS grant pot that would work. Grant funding would be the way we would want to consider it. But I'd also want to build in some really significant sustainability so that we weren't doing one thing 1 year and another thing somewhere else.
Right, well, I think you're right, actually. I think a number of big voluntary organisations have been, perhaps corrupted is the wrong word, but certainly weighed down by taking on state funding or from the NHS. And it's changed their kind of aim and purpose. I tend to think of something like mine when I say that, but anyway.
Yeah, and some of the big justice sectors, organisations. And I think it's one of the really challenging things. I mean, the current discussion around the sentencing review has, in the way that it's discussed, a recognition that they'll need to work with the third sector to deliver on some of the aims and ambitions, in particular the kind of support for people leaving prison. It's a really interesting question. What do we mean by the third sector? Oh, you mean charities? Oh, okay. So do you mean the 500,000 million turnover charity, or do you mean the 50 million or the 100 million charity? Because here's a small group who do some really meaningful work but don't take government money. And here's a really big group who are paid for everything, but operate like a corporate, but they're technically a charity and get referred to as the third sector. So yeah, it's a really complex area, and I think that's essentially what you're getting at, isn't it? Is that when you are drawn down that path, which does often inexorably get linked to inexorable growth, because that's how they see themselves as being sustained. There's lots of great work done, but it can then be really challenging.
And it almost inevitably leads to decline further down the line when funding is reduced. So you've mentioned volunteers, so I presume if somebody links on your website, they'll see how to get in contact with you and offer their services. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a contact form and a description of some of the volunteering opportunities, and they're brilliant because they're sort of standalone, so you don't have to commit to kind of monthly or set days. You can work it around your diary. And I often say a great starter for people if they're not sure is actually to come to a graduation, because in a graduation you're kind of in the audience, as it were. You might get called upon to do something, but not in a way that would be kind of exposing or uncomfortable, in that sometimes they throw questions out to the audience. But it's a great way to get a sense of what Stand Out kind of looks and feels like and does. And at the end of the afternoon, there is a great opportunity then to have conversations with the participants, and chat informally with them and find out how they found the programme, and about prison and about their ambitions for life afterwards. So it's a great way to start. And then we also have the CV writing sessions and mock interviews. And volunteers really love them. I think people, when people want to come in, they're then really fascinated by that. And the reflections are so often, of course, not surprisingly, they're just people, that they are, it is part of our society. And I think that's a really important piece of work to do, to give people an opportunity to come in. And we encourage them to do that and encourage them to then reflect on it and think about who they can share that experience with, because the more people that we can have who stand, humanizing the justice system when so often people are dehumanized in it, that is to our benefit, I think.
It's really lovely to hear somebody talking so positively in such an upbeat way about the prison system, because it can often feel a little bit bleak. And I wondered how you keep yourself balanced and healthy and maintain such a upbeat mindset.
I was going to say, I think I can be really upbeat about the people in prison. The system is really challenging. And there are so many things in it that we face challenges. But yeah, we're very determined, so we try hard to keep positive about it. I work hard to try and keep fit. I think I've kind of, certainly in my latter stages of life, as I've got older, I've realised how important that is. Harder to do, but more important. I love walking. That's probably my single biggest passion. I don't get to do enough of it, but I love walking Cornish coastal paths. If I can get to a mountain, I'd love to walk a mountain, but I don't get to do that so often. I really enjoy cooking. One of my real de-stressing exercises, not just like the routine weekday supper, but if I get a day, I love a Saturday when I maybe have got some friends around and I'll just cook, and I'll just end up deciding to do things as I'm cooking. And I find that just really, well, for me, it's creative as well. So yeah, if I get like 4 hours, 5 hours in my kitchen and get to produce 5 or 6 different things, I just love it. And everyone always turns around and says, "Oh, you've made way too much food."
Thank you very much, Penny. Good to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm glad we made it.
Yeah, me too.